And we're rolling. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the closing program in support of the Citizens at Last, the Women's Suffrage Movement in Texas exhibit we have on display in the library. The exhibit will be on display at the library until May 10th, so please stop by and view the display, grab one of our books on the display, and one of our reading guides. If social media is your thing, please take a selfie with the display and tag at LSC-CyFair Library if that's your thing. And you can find us on most social platforms by searching for the handle at LSC-CyFair Library. And I also want to encourage you to follow the National Park Service on social media and the Belmont-Paul Equality Monument. This program is being recorded for the library's Women's Suffrage Guide, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions or comments, please type them into the Q&A or the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. As a gentle reminder, please keep all comments and questions courteous and civil. We're here to learn, not to debate any facts. But okay, so now I am honored to introduce our National Park Ranger, Susan Philpott of the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality Monument. And Ranger Philpott is here to share the intersectional story of suffragists who were struggling against sexism and racism while also fighting for the right to vote. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much, Regina. Hello, everybody. Well, I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And I am, as Regina mentioned, a park ranger at the Belmont-Paul Women's Equality National Monument, which I know is kind of a mouthful there. So we are a 200-year-old house in Washington, D.C. This is a picture of it here. We're on the corner of Constitution Avenue and 2nd Street Northeast down in Washington, D.C., right on Capitol Hill. That white building you see in the background there is the Hart Senate office building. So a bunch of senators have their offices looking out over our courtyard. Just a little map to give you a sense of where we are. If you're familiar with Washington, D.C., you can see on the map here the U.S. Capitol, the U.S. Supreme Court, and then this is us just right across Constitution Avenue. So we look right at the side of the Supreme Court. So right in the heart of national government there. And we are a part of the National Park Service because this house was the headquarters of the National Woman's Party, founded by Alice Paul. And you're looking at an interior shot of the house now, which, as you can see, is a museum. For over 90 years, the National Women's Party has been in this spot deliberately right there in the heart of power. And for a long time, they were an organization that fought for women's equality. They were lobbyists, and starting in 1997, though, they became an educational nonprofit. So keeping the mission going by telling the story. And then the National Park Service came in 2016. And so we've been really happy to share with them in telling this story. Particularly the story we tell in this space is about women's struggle for the right to vote, or suffrage. The National Women's Party created the exhibits, and we came in and began interpreting those exhibits. And so I'm going to be showing you some pictures of those exhibits, but also things that aren't there. And actually, let me move back one. I should say this doesn't actually look like this right now because the house itself is under renovation. And so we've taken all the collections out. The National Women's Party no longer exists. So when we come back into this space, we really are looking at finding new and better ways to tell this story. A lot of people start the history of the fight for women's right to vote with some of the founding mothers, like you see here a bust of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who organized the Seneca Falls, one of the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, women's rights getting people together for the purpose of talking about women's rights in July 1848. And also, you're looking at the other side of the hallway now. People are usually pretty familiar here with this woman here, Susan B. Anthony, who spent her whole life fighting for women's rights, particularly the right to vote. Although at our site, we really kind of tell the story of later generations of suffragists fighting particularly for the 19th Amendment. But for the purpose of this story, we're going to start there with those founding mothers. Now, we're going to be covering over 7 decades of history here. So we're just going to hit on a few highlights. I can't tell the whole story and do it justice, but particularly looking at the words of the people who are involved in this movement. Now, you can tell looking around here that the National Women's Party was kind of telling their story. And when we came in, at least, every single picture was a picture of a white woman. Every statue was white women, upper class white women, which certainly gave the wrong impression about what the true fight for women's suffrage was like. And we want to do a little better job of telling that story. Now, for a long time, that's sort of the story that people knew, that they saw in their history books, and probably because, you know, the people who wrote the original history were some of those white women that we mentioned: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and some other, Matilda Gage, Ida Harper. They're telling the story of themselves. So we're grateful to them for doing that, because, you know, if women didn't write down their history, it could be that we would have lost this entirely. But it also meant that, you know, when you tell your own story, you tell the good parts, right? And you leave out the people maybe that you didn't like as much, or you didn't agree with. And so for a long time, that was really the history that people had. It was so good, though, that we hit the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 2020, because it really gave birth to a lot more scholarship, a lot that was there already, but maybe people weren't looking at, and then some new research that's come out. So as we look at these exhibits, we want to make sure that we're telling a deeper story. For instance, when we're looking at that Women's Rights Convention as marking that maybe as one of the first moments in the fight for women's suffrage, and the document that Women's Rights Convention came up with, the Declaration of Sentiments, we look at that document. It's one of our primary documents, and the list that these radical thinkers brought together about all the ways that women were not treated equally in 1848. And as you can see, it was a long list. When they talked about that all men and women are created equal, they said basically that their claim was that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct objects the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. So they're writing the list of all the ways that mankind has established a tyranny over women. Now, one of those was that women were not able to vote, and that would eventually become sort of the focus of the movement. But as you can see, that's not all on the list. Well, here's one of the things that's on that list. And this is a picture of Elizabeth Cady Stanton over on the left. They said, he has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded of men, both natives and foreigners. So right from the outset, you can see that there is a feeling among these women fighting for rights, that they're sort of acknowledging a social hierarchy, political, economic hierarchy, and not necessarily challenging it altogether, just saying that they, particularly the white women, are in the wrong place. Now, as far as we know, the only African American who attended that first Women's Rights Convention was Frederick Douglass. And he was, throughout his life, a supporter of women's rights. In fact, it was him standing up during that convention and affirming Elizabeth Cady Stanton's assertion that one of the things they should be fighting for was women's rights to vote, giving the weight of his authority towards that. He said, basically, if you want the rest of the items on the list, you need the vote to make them happen. But he would not be, that convention really spurred lots and lots of other women's rights conventions that had a higher reach, a longer reach, and it started a movement around the country. And one of the people who would attend those women's rights convention was this woman, Sojourner Truth, who had been enslaved in New York, basically, sued for and got her own freedom, and changed her name to Sojourner Truth to say that she believed that it was her mission to travel around the country, to sojourn, and to tell people the truth. And one of the places she told people the truth was at women's rights conventions. Maybe her most famous speech was at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1851, where she stood up and said to the white women and the men there, basically, that they were missing a part of the story. They were the story you're telling about women's equality, you need to talk to Black women if you're going to make those assertions. She said, I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man, and I can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man is now. So this idea that, Black women don't get treated as if they need extra protection or privileges. They're expected to endure the same indignities and oppression as Black men. They do the same work as Black men. And so Black women are embodying this idea of equality that you're talking about, but you're not listening to us. And that will kind of be a theme throughout the fight for women's right to vote. That speech is often known as the Ain't I a Woman speech. The version I am quoting from was written up in the Anti-Slavery Bugle by Marius Robinson, who was there shortly after the convention happened. So probably a more accurate version than a later version that was published. This version doesn't have the words Ain't I a Woman in it at all. Now, I wanted to point out that I mentioned that those exhibits that we're looking at at the Belmont-Paul were created by the National Woman's Party, telling the National Woman's Party story, basically, from the things that they have, and leaving out a lot of the story. One of the things we discovered as the National Park Service came in was that the National Woman's Party had this very stunning sculpture of Sojourner Truth in their collection, but it wasn't on display. Up until we closed at the start of the pandemic, we did have this on display. That bust of Susan B. Anthony had been lent to the Library of Congress, and so we put Sojourner Truth on display there. But as a lot of things in the hallway, it doesn't have a lot of context to it. On the right, you see the museum exhibit label that's on the pedestal, and you can see that it's just sort of a piece of paper stuck over the other one, and it was kind of peeling off. So people who came to the museum would see, well, this is something that's been sort of stuck on later. That's not the story we want to be telling about this. The story of Black women in the fight for women's right to vote is not a story that should be sort of stuck in places. It's an important part of the entire story. One of the people who's not in our museum and didn't make it into the history of women's suffrage written by Stanton and Anthony and others, but who was a very influential part of that early movement was Frances Harper, who was a journalist and a poet and a writer, and she's going to these women's rights conventions too, and doing the same thing as Sojourner Truth in the earlier days, calling out the part of this this argument that's being missed, that the wisdom that Black women bring to this story. And she stood up during a women's rights convention in May 1866 in New York City and talked about why we needed to look at equality as a whole cloth. And not leave people out of the story. She said, born of a race whose inheritance have been outrage and wrong, most of my life has been spent in battling against these wrongs. But I did not feel as keenly as others that I had these rights in common with other women, which are now demanded. And she said, to kind of calling out to those white women, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. So we're connected to each other and we need to listen to each other. And she said, again, you're speaking about rights, but I'm speaking about wrongs. There's a greater injustice. I'm paraphrasing her, that Black women are facing that you need to be paying attention to. Now, you notice that's May 1866. That's after the women's rights movement has been going on for over a decade, and it's right after the Civil War. So a lot of the people who are involved in the fight for women's rights, started activism as abolitionists, and women sort of put aside the call for rights during the Civil War as they are for their own rights, as they're supporting the war effort and kind of believing that they will show themselves to be patriotic citizens and then will be rewarded with the vote after the war is won and slavery is abolished. And it didn't work out that way. One of the most important things that happens right after the Civil War is, in addition to ending slavery, is the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And this is the first time that the whole idea of who is a citizen is defined in the U.S. Constitution. And it says, everybody born or naturalized is an equal citizen and has, this is the well-known part of it, that you have due process of law and equal protection of the laws, whoever you are. Great. However, the 14th Amendment also introduces for the first time into the Constitution the word male. It's in the section 2. It has to do with the right to vote. It's kind of a convoluted section, but the idea that that voting is tied to maleness now in the U.S. Constitution becomes a horror to those who've been fighting for women's rights. And so the question becomes, do we, as women's rights activists, support the 14th Amendment to the Constitution? Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's answer is absolutely not. She says, if we put that word male into the Constitution, it'll take us 100 years to get it out. Maybe it still is still there and still hasn't gotten out. But people like Sojourner Truth, too, are worried about this, too. Feeling like, if colored men get their rights, she says, and not colored women, you'll see colored men be masters over the women, and it will be just as bad as it was before. Now, she's not against Black men getting rights, including the right to vote, but she is worried about what that's going to mean for women. And so then you can see this Black women sort of stuck between these two forces, the white women on one side, the Black men on the other, and where do they fit as we talk about rights? Are we really all bound up together? So the question in the women's rights movement about whether to support the 14th Amendment starts to get ugly. The 14th Amendment is passed and ratified in 1868, and then it seems fairly quickly after that more is going to need to be done if Black men are going to be able to vote. And this really brings out the worst in people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who feel betrayed that they are being pushed to the side and feeling like their rightful place in this social hierarchy is not being appreciated. So you have these kind of words coming out of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This is something that she published in her newspaper, The Revolution, which, by the way, she got funding for from a guy named George Train, who was an avid racist and white supremacist. And you can hear the ugliness that has come into this movement where once these ideas have been joined. And it's not just about Black men, it's all about basically assorting white women's superiority, because she says, think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Youngtung, who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who never read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for, and then she lists 3 really accomplished notable women: Lydia Marie Childs, Lucretia Mott, Fanny Kemble. Those are names people would have known at the time. So you can hear here, she's not just Black men, but Irish and German and Chinese, so immigrant men who are not considered, in her mind, maybe equal citizens with the educated white women, of which she considers herself. So you hear the ugliness that has come into this movement, and it really explodes at a meeting in 1869. By this point, the anti-slavery societies have slavery has been abolished. So they're sort of this new organization, which is the American Equal Rights Association, which is very short-lived because of these things. And at what becomes their last meeting in 1869, Frederick Douglass stood up and called out that kind of talk from people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and explained why he was saying, if we have to make a choice, if the social situation is such that we have to choose between Black men and women, we need to choose Black men first. He said, when women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. So really strong, visceral words. And, this strain in what had been a very close friendship that Frederick Douglass had with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. This will lead sort of to this idea that maybe Black men don't support women's suffrage. And that's not a fair comparison. Of course, Black men are not a monolith like any population, but leaders like Frederick Douglass and later Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois will again and again speak out in support of women's rights, including right to vote. Frederick Douglass stayed a women's rights man his whole life. So it's a false split there, but it does end up being a split. And people like Frances Harper are caught in the middle. So, that Black women are being called like from both sides. Throw your support behind your race, and the Black men will support you. Throw your support behind your sex, and the white women will see that you're taken care of. Frances Harper does say, well, the white women, they all go for sex. That the thing we should care about is that we are women before we are Black. And this, as I said, leads to there are then 2 suffrage organizations formed. The National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Stanton and Anthony. And they are fighting for lots of things on that list of the Declaration of Sentiments, all the ways women are treated unequally. And they begin to believe that if Black men are going to get the vote through constitutional amendment, then that's the way women need it as well. The other group, called the American Woman Suffrage Association, Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, Josephine Ruffin become part of that. They believe in supporting suffrage for Black men first, and then with an amendment to the Constitution, and then they're going to fight for women's right to vote on the state level. And so this is a split that leads to not a lot happening for a long time. And Black women joined both groups. So it's not as if all the Black women are with American Women's Suffrage Association, but there is a strain and struggle in the movement. The 15th Amendment, as I mentioned, comes around then in 1870. Again, do white women support this? White women suffragists? I have not found anywhere that Susan B. Anthony said this herself, although in modern tales it's often attributed to her, but that someone said it about her, that she would sooner cut off her right arm before she would ever work for or demand the ballot for the Black man and not the woman. So you can hear just, again, that sort of visceral, emotional tension that's going on in the movement. The 15th Amendment, of course, does become ratified in 1870. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. You see this illustration on the right from Harper's Bazaar that is often associated with the 15th Amendment, of Black men from different walks of life, from the farm to the merchant to the Civil War veteran, all coming to cast their ballot. That's sort of the image that people often attribute to the 15th Amendment. But I like this illustration too. It's called Balloting in the South. And you can see here is a man sort of explaining what's going to be on the ballot, with a bunch of other Black men, maybe in a farming community, gathering together to listen in and lean in. But look, you can see that the women are there too. They might be pushed off to the periphery, to the sides, but they're listening, they're leaning in, they're paying attention. And this becomes a real sense of Black women seeing the vote as something that the community does together. They get educated together. And then the men go out sort of and vote for the community. Doesn't mean that Black women don't also think that they should have the right to vote. But given the current circumstances, this is one of the ways that women get their voices heard during this period of time. The split in the suffrage movement, men's, by 1890, this is actually a picture from a couple of years earlier, but you can get a sense that you can see that the women who started the movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, are getting elderly. Also Lucy Stone, who's not in this picture, getting elderly. And the next generation, their daughters and nieces and the next ones, really want to see that split healed and convince the two groups to come back together and form the rather awkwardly named National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA for short. In that coming back together, what happens is the idea of the constitutional amendment sort of gets pushed to the side, and the focus becomes on winning women the votes in the states, which that same year, Wyoming, which had been a territory where women could vote, becomes a state where women can vote. And in the next couple of years, there's a couple more: Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. That's it, though, for a while. So this fighting for women's vote on the state level, maybe for the suffrage on the same terms as men, maybe just in local elections or in school board elections, it's a lot of work, and they have a lot more defeats than they do successes. One of the reasons they decide to focus on suffrage in the states, though, is because by this point, the Reconstruction era, where Black men have been elected to offices and are voting, it has crumbled, and that their voting is often, particularly in the South, being suppressed through violence and other oppression. And focusing on states' rights and state voting is a way to kind of pander to white supremacists, particularly in the South. And so as the leadership of the suffrage movement does that, the white leadership, they sort of push Black women to the side. Now, Black women have always organized. They've always had their own clubs in addition to joining the white-led clubs. In 1896, there's an organization that comes together to sort of organize those efforts that are local church-related organizations, known as the National Association of Colored Women. And they have a slogan, lifting as we climb. So this idea that those who make progress or maybe have more prosperity, more economic opportunities, then use that to help their community and support those in their local communities. The first president of the National Association of Colored Women is a prominent suffragist, Mary Church Terrell, who we'll see pictures of in a minute, who is internationally known as a suffragist. She speaks several languages and travels around the world fighting for women's right to vote. And again, is another one of those voices who's calling out to the white women, staying involved in those organizations, but calling them out that they need to care about Black women's rights as well. And the National Association of Colored Women works for many, many different things for their community, but one of them is supporting the idea of women's right to vote. So this idea of expanding the suffrage movement into the South among the white power structure is gaining momentum in the early 20th century, the late 19th, early 20th century. There is a NASA convention, which had been held either in the Northeast or in Washington, D.C. There's one in Atlanta in 1896, and then one in New Orleans in 1903. And while NASA says they don't take any position on whether these local chapters ought to be segregated or integrated, they let the states decide for themselves. For both of those, the leadership asks Black women, and in the case of the 1895 one in Atlanta, Frederick Douglass, to stay away. So this is Kate Gordon, who is the leader of the New Orleans Women's Suffrage Association. She is very adamant that the vote should only be for white women and that Black women shouldn't be included. And so you see names of leaders, including Susan B. Anthony, who are attending this convention even though they know that Black women have been excluded. Later on, Kate Gordon will actually end up opposing the 19th Amendment, even though she is an avid supporter of women's suffrage, because she doesn't think that there should be something in the Constitution. And she really wants to see Louisiana only enfranchise white women. So the Black women in New Orleans, there's a very vibrant and organized Black women's suffrage organization in New Orleans. They have their own convention and their own meeting, and Susan B. Anthony comes the next day to address them. So that's her way of kind of appeasement, I guess. They have their club is called the Phyllis Wheatley Club, and Sylvanie Williams, who's the one you see pictured here in the middle, stands up and calls Susan B. Anthony to task as gently and genteelly as she can, gives a speech to introduce her that says basically, Black women have been the flowers, the beautiful flowers trampled underfoot by the white women suffragists. But she says, yet she is advancing, and sometimes you find her farther on than you might have expected. So Susan B. Anthony died a couple of years later in 1906, and a new generation of women is taking over leadership of the suffrage movement, including NASA. Anna Howard Shaw becomes the president, and she is basically called upon to address the charge, the accusation that NASA is an integrationist organization. So she doesn't have to answer to their racism. She has to answer to the idea that NASA is fighting for integration, for an end of white supremacy. And she's not the only one who does this, or argues basically that women winning the vote would help maintain white supremacy. that once there are more white women voting, that will help strengthen white power, basically, in South. And the reason that she's sort of giving about this is she talks again about how when the Civil War happened and women, put aside their efforts to demand the vote in the belief that when the war was over, the country would recognize their patriotic service and reward them with the ballot, the crowning symbol of citizenship. But instead of recognizing their service and rewarding the loyal women, the cry went forth, "This is the Negro's hour. Let the women wait." And they are still waiting. As they wait, they are not blind to the fact that this nation did what no other nation has ever done when it voluntarily made its former slaves the sovereign rulers of its loyal and patriotic women. The white is silent in that phrase. So you can see that this argument that started with the Declaration of Sentiments, or was there at the beginning, that there's a correct hierarchy to society, white women are just in the wrong place, is continuing with the next generation. And Mary Church Terrell, again, was always speaking up against this. And she said, basically, this is a fool's game. She said, "You will never get suffrage until the sense of justice has been so developed in men that they will give fair play to the colored race." So hearkening back to Frances Harper's call that we're all bound up together, and you can't section off Black women and expect that you'll get something that looks like equality. Just another way that racism shows up in the suffrage movement and all over. The New York Women's Suffrage Association has a convention, and they invite Harriet Tubman, the well-known abolitionist and leader of the Underground Railroad. By this point, she is elderly. This is in the early 1900s. I mean, they're touting that Harriet Tubman is coming. Isn't this great? She travels there by train. She's there on the train with other suffragists who are so happy to see her, traveling from Auburn to Rochester. When she gets there, she has to sleep in the train station because there are no places in Rochester where a Black woman could rent a room. And so the next day, the white women realize this and find a place for her to stay. But here she is, their honored guest, and they haven't even recognized how racism is going to affect her in Rochester. So the story we tell at Belmont-Paul is really of kind of that third generation, the new women who come along, particularly Alice Paul, who you see here on the left. She got involved in the fight for women's right to vote in Britain. She's been one of the militant suffragettes who's gone to jail and gone on hunger strike. She's kind of a celebrity when she comes back to the U.S. She approaches the leadership of NASA, who you see over here on the right. You see Anna Howard Shaw here in the middle left, and then next to her is Carrie Chapman Catt. They both were very close with Susan B. Anthony. They're now leading the organization. Alice Paul is feeling like this movement has been going on for many decades, and the things you ladies have been doing are just not getting the job done. We need to see some of that energy in Britain here in the United States. So she comes in and she convinces the NASA leadership to stir things up a little bit with a women's suffrage procession down Pennsylvania Avenue on the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration on March 3rd, 1913. And she's going to get thousands of women from around the country to come and march. And they will be led by this woman you see here. This is Inez Milholland. Maybe, unless you're a suffrage aficionado, we don't know the name Inez Milholland too much now, but everybody knew who she was at the time. She was, first of all, she was a very accomplished person. She was a lawyer, and she used her legal skills in the fight for civil rights. Her dad was one of the founders of the NAACP. She was a dynamic speaker But that's not why she's well known. She's well known because she's really pretty. She's known as the most beautiful suffragist. So she's kind of becomes the poster child in the story that Alice Paul is telling of the new woman of the 20th century, saying, this is not your grandmother's suffrage movement. We are the new young. This is what a feminist looks like, she's saying, all in white on a white horse, the herald of the future, wearing the crown that will eventually inspire Wonder Woman's tiara. So the story Alice Paul's got in her mind that she's going to tell here right in the streets of the nation's capital, so that the next day the president has to walk in her footsteps. It's really a white woman's story. This is the planning committee for that suffrage procession. Alice Paul there in the middle. Now, Alice Paul, born in New Jersey, she's a Quaker. She's marched in New York, and Black women have participated, and immigrant women, Chinese women have participated in those marches. She sort of assumes that's going to happen here in Washington, D.C., but along comes local Washingtonians, or the wife of a congressman, Elizabeth Kent here, and Helen Gardner, and they tell her, Alice, we don't do that here in Washington, D.C. This is a southern town. If you have an integrated march, the white women won't have it, and you're going to upset the southern segregationists. So Alice Paul goes along with what she's told, and she tries to keep Black women from marching. And you hear from the NAACP's reporting what happens. She says the Women's Suffrage Party had a hard time settling on the status of Negroes in the Washington parade. At first, Negro callers were received coolly at headquarters. Then they were told to register, but found that the registry clerks were usually out. Finally, an order went out to segregate them in the parade, but telegrams and protests poured in, and eventually the colored women marched according to their state and occupation without let or hindrance. So, although sometimes you'll hear in the history that Black women were forced to march in the back, it's clear Alice Paul wanted them to, but based on this and some other reporting, I don't think they did. But you can see the cartoon over on the right from the New York Tribune. That's certainly the impression they leave with the nation. You see this cartoon that says, just like the men, and the white woman suffragist is holding her hand out to say to the Black woman suffrage, no, not you. And it says votes for white women only. Some of the stories we know are that we have lists by Carrie Clifford, who was there, one of the Black women organizers, of Black women marching in with their professions or with their state delegations. And one of the stories they tell is these women, Delta Sigma Theta was a brand new sorority that had just been formed at Howard University with the purpose of being socially active. And so one of the first things they want to do is they want to march in the suffrage procession, and the procession committee tries to keep them out. But we know that they marched with the other college women. You see a picture on the right of the group of women from different colleges. We don't see the Deltas in that picture, but they marched with their mentor, Mary Church Terrell. And the story she told is that who was the one who made sure that they marched where they belong was Inez Milholland. So if Alice Paul is holding Inez up as this is the new woman of the 20th century, maybe she should be paying attention to how Inez embodied, and stood for that idea of being bound together and that equality for all. This is, you can see the display in our museum, all these great stories, none of them there. So hopefully when we make new exhibits, we'll be able to tell more of these stories, including my favorite story, which is about the Illinois suffragists. So this is a picture from the newspaper of some of the Illinois suffragists. They're led there by Grace Trout in the middle. And on the right, you see Miss Virginia Brooks. She's going to show up again. When the Illinois suffragists gather on Pennsylvania Avenue, getting ready to march, they apparently have gotten word that it was supposed to be a whites-only march. So they turn to, Grace Trout, I should say, turns to the only Black woman of their delegation, my favorite suffragist, Ida B. Wells Barnett and tell her that, sorry, Ida, you can't march with us. You'll have to, we heard that the Black women were supposed to go to the back. And Ida B. Wells gets very angry and says, if the Illinois women do not take a stand now in this great Democratic parade, then the colored women are lost. And I really believe that she was saying, you know, we know how to organize even better than you do, and you need us in this fight. And she says, I was asked to march with the other women of our state, and I intend to do so or not take part in the parade at all. So she marches off, she storms off, and Virginia Brooks says, well, I'm not going to let her go off by herself. If she's leaving, I'm leaving too. One of the other women says, Virginia, what will people say? She says, let them say anything that they please. I cannot prevent that, but I can prevent having one of our delegation left to march alone, almost as if she were in disgrace. So Virginia Brooks and another ally, Belle Squire, leave with Ida B. Wells. They don't go to the back, though. They wait along the procession route, and when the Illinois suffragists appear, they step right out in front. So this is a newspaper was able to capture this moment of Ida B. Wells Barnett leading the Illinois suffrage delegation, along with Virginia Brooks and Belle Squire, her allies, next to her there. This is the only picture we have of that moment, though, and you can tell it's a picture of a newspaper, so it's not a great photo, but we have to get that into our exhibit somehow. This is the only picture we have right now of Ida B. Wells in our displays. You can see it's another temporary pop-up that's put there. The text was written by a college intern. He was wonderful and found all kind of great things, but you know, it's a text heavy. It's not telling a very good story. So that's something that we need to do a better job of telling in the future. Mary Church Terrell, we find this moment where she's been interacting with Walter White, the head of the NAACP, and he's sort of repeating back to her in this letter what Mary had said to him. He said, just as you say, all of them are mortally afraid of the South, and if they could get the suffrage amendment through without enfranchising colored women, they would do it in a moment. And despite that, Mary Church Terrell participates in the National Women's Party's best known campaign, which is picketing the White House. That she says that the National Women's Party would call her up again and again, she and her daughter Phyllis, when they needed some people out on the front lines picketing the White House, and they would go. We don't have a picture of them picketing, but this idea of being kind of transgressive in the fight for rights was something that was dangerous, particularly for Black women. So the courage that Mary Church Terrell and her daughter showed to show up on those picket lines again and again is important to note. They didn't go to jail once the women started getting arrested. That was not a risk that they were able to take, you know, and not something that would have gotten the publicity and sympathy that white women going to jail got. In fact, some of these suffragists, when they went to jail, the prison officials, to shame them, put them with Black women prisoners, because even the prison was segregated, and that was meant to humiliate them. They did talk about how interacting with the Black women prisoners kind of opened their eyes to some of the injustices that Black women face, the kind of things they were getting arrested for, and what the justice system looked like for them. And one of them, Doris Stevens, talked about that as they're having these conversations and feeling this sympathy for what the Black women are facing, that they think about getting involved in what we would call criminal justice reform today, and then they don't do it. They decide that what they need to do is fight for women to have the vote, and then, you know, basically then the white women will fix it when they get the vote. So they never take up that cause. I don't have very good pictures of it, but I just did want to show that Mary Church Terrell's picture was added to our Hall of Portraits after the National Park Service came in. Again, like the Sojourner Truth, not great context, but trying to get more of those stories in. Just a quick story I wanted to tell from Texas. I'm sure you have lots of stories in your exhibits from Texas, but tell the story of Maud Simpson. Now, this is a picture from 1954, so this is later. But Maud Simpson was not only the head of the El Paso NAACP, but she also formed the El Paso Negro Women's Civic and Enfranchisement League, so a Black women's suffrage organization in Texas. And what she tries to do is get her group affiliated with NASA. Now, this is a story about NASA, which was always the larger, much better funded, much more influential women's suffrage group. But I'm sure something similar would have happened if they'd tried to become a part of the National Women's Party and Alice Paul. And that is basically that Carrie Chapman Catt said no. She said, I presume, and this again, even someone from the North who's saying, we don't necessarily agree with all the things that happen with the Southern segregationists, but she says, I presume that no colored women's leagues are members in Southern states, although I don't know positively that this is true. So basically, Black women's leagues can't come in to be affiliated with NASA. And then she says, I think in some northern states, individual colored women are direct members. So in the North, Black women can join, although the Black women's groups can't be part of NASA. And then she says, of course, these women in the North are women with a good deal of white blood and are educated women. Otherwise, they would not be asking auxiliaryship. So you can just hear the kind of racism that these Black women have to face from those who say they're fighting for equality. Grace Trout from Illinois is in this picture too. By the way, she's still part of the leadership. This is actually a picture from 1920 of the League of Women Voters, which is what NASA became, but it's the same leadership. That's the leadership of NASA. Later on, Alice Paul was asked, as she was an elderly woman, about these kind of conflicts and why she was making the decisions that she was making throughout the suffrage movement. This is her answering in 1974 when she's elderly. She said, I feel very strongly that if you're going to do anything, you have to take one thing and do it. You can't try lots and lots of reforms and get them all mixed up together. So she saw, and she would say this over and over again, that she saw Black women's issues as race issues, not sex issues. And she would say that that's not my issue. And then she says, I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there's nothing complicated about ordinary equality. And this gets quoted a lot, and I really just don't know what to do with that at all. I mean, because everything we've shown here and everything that Alice Paul was involved in shows that when you start talking about equality, yes, it becomes complicated. Whose equality are you talking about? What kind of equality are you talking about? For instance, now this is the last thing I'll show you from our exhibits, and this was made for us from our friends over at the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. So we put it up again as sort of a temporary exhibit of all the complications just when you're talking about voting and how equality gets complicated when you talk about voting. All the ways that people have been prevented from voting, women and men, both in the past and up to today. When the National Women's Party, when the League of Women Voters were asked to take up these issues as part of their continuing fight for women's equality, Alice Paul would say again and again, that's a race issue, not a sex issue. That's not our issue. So as we create the new exhibits, we hope that we will be guided by the words of my favorite suffragist, Ida B. Wells Barnett. The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. So I hope that we can continue to expose more of the truth of the ongoing struggle for women's equality.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Susan. I know I learned a lot today, and I enjoyed this program, and I'm glad that you highlighted that you know, the unique position that Black women found themselves in and still do. So they were, you know, found themselves pulled in two directions. Black men wanted them to support the race issue, and white women wanted them to support elevating women's inferior status by, you know, fighting for the vote. And it took Black women and Black reformers like Mary Church Terrell to say, you know, we can't fight for one or the other. We live at the intersection of racism and sexism, and we have to fight for both. And I think it's important to point out the reason why we don't see as many photos of Black women protesting, like the famous picture of the silent sentinels in front of the White House, is because they were purposefully left out of those photos. They white women suffragists wanted to project this image of that white middle class woman going to the polls to vote. They were afraid that if they showed working class women or Black women, any woman of color, that it was going to hinder their, you know, their chances for getting the 19th Amendment. So all of this recovery work that's being done right now and has been going on for decades by women historians is revealing and covering all of these stories and giving us a more holistic view of the women's suffrage movement. But can you tell us a little bit about changing the exhibits at the Belmont-Paul House? What, you know, when did you decide that, or when did they decide that this needed to happen? What was the inspiration?
So I should say everything with the National Park Service moves slowly, and you know, there's getting the funding and all of that. But part of it is that the house is undergoing renovation. So there's a lot of things are being fixed, including plaster that are affecting the interior walls. And then also the National Women's Party ceased operations and transferred their collections to the National Park Service. So while before we were interpreting what the National Women's Party had created, now we're going to have to put things back differently. So we want to take that opportunity to tell deeper and more complex stories. That's part of the mission of the National Park Service, whereas the National Women's Party was creating a museum about themselves. We want to be the Women's Equality National Monument. And while the National Women's Party will always be the focus, the center, it's not the sole story. And we really want to tell, you know, because the National Park Service wants to be the place where that the civic space where we wrestle with the past and how that is affecting things today. That's part of our mission.
Fantastic. So when will everything be finished and ready to be viewed by the public?
So that is a great question. The construction that was supposed to be done by spring of 2023 is, of course, already hitting delays. And we don't have the final funding for redoing the exhibits yet. We're still even just in the process of accessioning and storing the collections. So I would say we might end up opening the museum before we've truly been able to redo the exhibits. I would guess it probably won't be until late 2023, maybe into 2024. But in the meantime, we're going to keep telling stories like this. And as you mentioned, follow us, look at our website, follow us on social media. We're going to keep getting, even when we don't have a physical space, we're going to keep being in the virtual space and telling these stories.
Fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? If so, feel free to unmute or type them in the chat box. And if you have questions that come to mind after the program, feel free to shoot me an email and I will pass them on to Susan.
Yep, and I'm going to put our website into the chat as well, and my email address, so that you can contact me directly too. And you know, and if you have a group that you'd like to have a program with, let me know. Happy to do that as well.
And I just want to thank you again for for joining us, everyone that's here, and for Susan for giving this closing program for our Citizens at Last exhibit. And I do think it's important to point out that that even after the 19th Amendment, Black women, Black men were still fighting for voting rights up until the Civil Rights Act of 1965, and Black women persisted and continued to fight for equality. And I wanted to point out that we are coming up, as you probably know, on the 100-year anniversary of um, the proposal of the Equal Rights Amendment. And the history behind that is fraught and interesting, and there's a lot that has happened over the past few years. So if you are interested in that, definitely check out our Women's Suffrage Library Guide, and I will follow up with an email and a link to that and for this recording. But again, thank you all so much for joining us. I appreciate you being here. Susan, as always, thank you so much for this wonderful program.
My
Everyone,
pleasure.
enjoy your week. Okay.